The title of this talk is Intergenerational Altruism and Transfers of Time and Money, a life cycle perspective. So, what's it about? Well, intergenerational persistence in outcomes like education, earnings and wealth have been well documented. And similarly well documented is the fact that parental investments in children vary substantially by parental background. Taking these two facts as our background, the goals of our paper are to firstly jointly estimate human capital production technology and parental investment preferences where parental transfers for investment take the form of parental time investments in children's human capital, educational investments, or direct intergenerational money transfer, debt intervenors or request. And then, with the model we estimate, we're going to evaluate policies that affect intergenerational persistence in outcome while allowing for behavioural response. In particular, we're going to look at policy relaxing intergenerational borrowing constraints via student loan. To do this, we're going to use 55 years of longitudinal data to estimate, in a first stage, child skill production functions, i.e. children's cognitive skills as a function of parental investments and other variables, and then wages as a function of the ultimate skill produced by these child skill production functions and education. Then we're going to take those two things that we estimate in the first stage and embed them in a dynastic model which we estimate in the second stage, in which parents care about the next generation altruistically and can influence their outcomes by investing in them over these three channels: time investments in their human capital, education investments, and direct cash transfer. The 55 years of longitudinal data we have comes from the NCDS, or National Child Development Study. Now, for those not familiar with the NCDS, it really is a wonderful resource, and I think kind of unique around the world, just by dint of being so long-lived and so forward-looking for its time. So the NCDS follows a population born in 1 week in Britain in 1958. And they're followed from birth right up till now approaching retirement. And for the time, the NCDS had very rich measures on those inputs to children's outcomes, such as parental characteristics, time investments in education, and on those outcomes themselves, like child, adolescent cognitive skills, earnings, and wealth. What do we find? In terms of technology of human capital production, we find modest complementarities between skill production in some early and some late time periods. But we find a very substantial complementarity in wage production between realized skill and education. When it comes to parental preferences over investment, we find that in order to match observed time investments, it's necessarily true that parents consider time investing in their children to be intermediate between work and leisure. i.e., it's not as arduous as going to work, but it's also not as fun as pure leisure. Then when we look at relaxing intergenerational borrowing constraints, we see that introducing student loans reduces intergenerational correlation in outcomes, and the biggest winners are going to be high-skilled kids of low-educated parents. But in fact, many children are going to be made worse off by this policy, and I'll talk more about that at the end. In terms of related literature, there's obviously vast literature looking at each one of these three transfer channels in isolation, be that parental time spent investing in children's human capital, educational investments, or intergenerational money transfers. And just a few of the most relevant and important papers to our own mentioned there. But the closest papers to our own are a smaller, more recent literature that try to investigate all three of these channels jointly through the lens of a structural model. And to this literature, our primary contribution is to bring to such models methods in skill production function estimation and data that directly links early life circumstances to outcomes over the whole life cycle. And the fact that we have this data set that allows us to track individuals from birth throughout the life cycle for the same individuals will perhaps allow us to reach some stronger conclusions in some other papers on a few questions. Now, at this point, I just want to present you some descriptive statistics to try and illustrate those two key facts I talked about on the first slide: the intergenerational persistence in outcomes and the variability by parental background of parental investment. Now, these key facts, they're not novel, but they are important. And I think it's important that we all have them clearly in our mind before we get into the model or estimation, because they do form the background of everything we do. Okay, in terms of inputs, the variability of inputs by parental background. So firstly, we see a very similar pattern across all three transfer channels. So in terms of time investments, we see parents with more education invest more time in their children's human capital. So in the NCDS, we're very lucky to have multiple measures of parental time investments in their children's human capital in early, mid, and late childhood. And when it comes to actual estimation, we're going to use all these measures jointly as noisy measures of underlying latent time investment variable. Just a few of the measures we have mentioned there for illustration, and for the descriptive statistics, I just want to focus in on one of them: teachers' assessment of parents' involvement in education. If we tabulate this variable by age and father's education, we see there's a substantial gap in the extent to which parents are judged to be interested in their education between the children of low, meant to be only having compulsory education, and high educated fathers, meaning having a university degree or higher. And so if we focus in at the very early stage, we already see a very large gap. Amongst the children of low educated fathers, 20 to 30% of the parents are judged to be interested in their child's education, but that jumps to 65 to 70% amongst the children of high educated fathers. When it comes to educational investments, we see again a very similar variation by parental background. Parents with more education have kids with more education. So if we just look at the fraction of children attaining post-compulsory education, we see that amongst the children of low-educated fathers, 70% of them go on to some post-compulsory education, but this jumps to 98% amongst the children of higher-educated fathers. So again, there's a large variation in parental investments by parental background. And then in terms of the final transfer channel we're going to look at, transfers, again, we see parents with more education give more cash to their kids. We see this both in terms of intervenous transfers and inheritances. And if we just zoom in on the mean figure, we see that children of low educated fathers receive about £2,000 in likely intervenous transfers and about £27,000 in inheritances. Again, this jumps massively when we look at the children of high educated fathers. They receive 10,000 in intervenous transfers and 115,000 in inheritances. So now looking at the intergenerational persistence of outcomes, we see that parents with more education have kids with greater cognitive skills. Now, again, in the NCDS, we're lucky to have multiple noisy measures of cognitive skills, which when it comes to actual estimation, we'll use in a latent fact approach. Some of the measures just mentioned here, but again, for descriptive statistics, I just want to focus in on maths and reading scores. And again, looking at the scores by father's education, we see a large difference between the children of low and high educated fathers. And these scores here, these are normalized Z scores. So the magnitude is interpretable. We'll be focusing on the finalized realized math score at age 16. we see that there's over one standard deviation difference between the children of low and the children of high educated fathers in terms of their maths scores. So quite important differences. And finally, in terms of this intergenerational persistence in outcomes, we see richer parents have richer kids, as encapsulated potentially also by other statistics, but here by the intergenerational aspect of earnings, i.e. the log-log correlation of earnings, which has been estimated for these cohorts to be around 0.35. So substantial persistence in earnings from one generation to the next. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to build and present to you a structural model that directly rationalizes these facts in order to use that model to investigate policies that can influence the intergenerational outcomes. Any questions up to this point?
Probably seems entirely wrong when you ask some questions at this stage. If I'm asking far too early. But the thing is, I'm very interested in Andrew Panic, who was a founding-centric philanthropist, worked out taking people or children too much money. Basically, you take away their enthusiasm to develop their potential as they go through adult life. I'm looking forward to hear whether you've actually extended your research into how successful those kids are when they actually develop their working life, as to whether they actually build on that additional wealth and additional education that they achieve as a result of their parents' interest.
I mean, it's a very interesting question, and the Carnegie effect that you just alluded to is something that we've discussed a lot when working on this project and related work. I think it can be very hard to untangle empirically the Carnegie effect from other things that are going on. For example, passing of wealth is going to be very correlated with the passing of human capital, and very interesting. It would be nice to follow up the children of this cohort more, which is not something yet, which is something that would be very nice to do. But yes, maybe I'm happy to talk more about what we know about that. But there's nothing really in the presentation more about Carnegie effect. It's certainly something, we have in our mind.
Okay. Although I guess the framework that we have really provides an ideal laboratory to think about within the context of the model decompositions where we could potentially think about what is the impact of those cash transfers on later supply of the young.
But there's also the education transfer. So you change the price of labor, you're given a high return. I would bet you can just tabulate they're working more hours, right? Or they're highly educated individuals. Who said
who's working highly?
No, the kids described they get more education.
They get more, I mean,
and that's one price of time that allows them to essentially earn. So under usual conditions, you think they would be a very positive effect. Not saying education in terms of education.
Right? So education, that's kind of what I was alluding to slightly. Educational transfers and wealth transfers are obviously highly correlated, and we could decompose in our models. Receiving more educational transfers will definitely, from the lens of our model, increase labour supply. But all else equal, and it's clearly not all else equal, more the very large wealth transfers could decrease. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm just going to run from the first question, which is about what else have you looked at? Because the NCDS has got so many different variables in there. It'd be really interesting to break this down more. And as a kid from a coastal town, what I will say, geography, I think, would be really interesting. But there are so many other aspects that might be useful. I don't know whether you've looked at that. And the other one is that obviously, if this cohort started in 1958, there was a very different number of people who went into higher education. So these relationships may or may not hold the same for cohorts which started kind of later on.
I mean, that's certainly true. So in related work, we do look at much richer set of channels. The downside of that is you can't have such a large model, but in related work, we do look at cognitive, non-cognitive skills, and not just time investments, school quality investments. So far, not geography, although we are discussing that. And then there is I mean, what's great about the NCDS is you can track these people from birth up to when I'm approaching retirement, but that necessarily comes with a trade-off. We are talking about the cohort, and but I think many of the lessons we learned are very valuable.
My observation of 50 years of watching this in my days in Cambridge through to now is that the Carnegie effect is minute. It's just a minute number of them around. Most people are in the buffet club by not by choice, but by force. They get enough money to that. And the choice with what to do, but not enough money to do nothing. I would just caution against getting too dragged off on these Carnegie sheets, let them go do what they want. But the vast majority, when the different close of knowledge, what the glory that they have is they have growth.
Mm-hmm.
They don't go down a mine because it's the only place to work. That's what they get. This is actually dragged off.
I think that's a very good point, and I don't think we have anything to really distinguish that for you today. Yeah. Very good point. Thank you very much for the questions. So, onto this model. I'm going to start with a high-level bird's-eye perspective of the model, just in the form of a timeline. So it's a dynastic model. So at any given point in time, there are two generations, the kids and the parents' generation. And so the parent generation are born at 0, like anywhere ever. And at that point in time, they're not independent decision makers. They depend on the grandparents' household, which is not shown here. But then they receive investments from their parents. But then at age 23, they become independent decision makers. They go off and they get married and they form their own household. And from that point in time, they make independent consumption, savings, and labour supply decisions in each period. Then at age 26, they're going to have children. There's going to be a pair of identical twins that arrive to the progeny. From that point on, the parents' household can choose how much to transfer to the child's household over these three transfer channels. Time investments, investing in their human capital early in life, and their skills. Then education, choosing how much post-compulsory education these children are able to have. And then finally, when the children themselves reach age 23, they go off and become independent. The parents' household has a one-time opportunity to make a financial transfer to the child's household. So from that point on, the two households separate, the kids go off and do their own thing, and the parents enter a later life phase in which they continue to make consumption, savings, and labour supply decisions, and also face some mortality risk. Drilling into some more details about the model, starting with preferences, we see that each household, the gender of each adult in the household, so for each gender, there's going to be a utility function, which is going to be a CRRA function of a Cobb-Douglas aggregator of consumption and leisure. Where leisure is going to be a function of your total time endowment, your hours worked, and your time spent investing in kids. Okay? So we start off with some time endowment T, from which we just subtract, very obviously, very standardly, the number of hours you work. We're also going to subtract the number of hours you spend with kids, but we're not necessarily going to subtract 100% of the hours you spend with kids. We're going to subtract theta, some fraction of the time you spend with kids, which is going to be a preference parameter that we estimate, which is going to try and capture how much people experience time investing in their children's human capital as work versus leisure. So of course, if this is 0, then it's time spent for kids is completely leisure, and if it's 1, it's completely work, and then if you're in between, it's a bit of both. Household utility is going to be the sum of both utility functions, the female scale by an equivalized household size, to capture the fact that the size of the household is changing. You have kids arriving and you have kids leaving. Households are going to discount the future at a rate beta, and lifetime utility standard time discounting factor, and they're going to discount the lifetime utility of children at a rate lambda. So this lambda is going to be our altruism parameter, capturing the fact that parents may care differentially about their own utility versus their children's. Again, it's going to be a key preference parameter that we estimate. So
there's no joint fraction in terms of joint utility, like a public good, right, for the family, the next generation.
there's no joint utility or public good.
Well, no, I'm just asking, how do you, with a husband and wife, right? Husband and wife. Wouldn't they include jointly the?
Apologies for those of you listening. Somebody jumped the gun on getting the microphone to them, so apologies, I can't give you the answer to what that question was.
How they care about the children's utility. That I'm going to show you towards the end of the section. But basically, it will turn up as a continuation factor. So they care about the child's lifetime utility when they separate, and they care about that discounted
I
value.
don't see it as a joint production. It's a joint out, it's a joint input, I should say. The kid is there, they're both sharing the services. It's like a house and car.
There is no, the children generate no service or utility until they're adults. So it's like an investment. The child is like an investment in the future, and they will both get the return from the investment.
Sorry.
Chinese attitude with kids. TIG, just looking at it.
Yeah.
It looks like you just additive in time.
Between
kids.
Yeah.
There's no, there's no complementarity there. There's no kind of joint production.
There's no complementarity in time. Yeah, time is first. In terms of production function, there's no complementarity. Completely additive in time and effort.
And it seems important that they're going to have a late supply side to allow some complementarity.
Complementarity like that.
We can come back to that.
Yes, let's come back to that. But yeah, that's a good point. Something we have to, but let's come back. Okay, so there's the preferences that households want to maximize when they make their choices, but they're obviously not completely free when they make those choices. It's going to make them subject to constraints. So let's look at those choices and those constraints. So every period, the household chooses consumption, leisure, supply, and saving. They're going to choose consumption of each adult. They're going to choose the hours worked of each adult, and they're going to choose how much to save in a risk-free asset. Then during the parenthood phase of life, they're going to choose how much to transfer to the second generation across these three transfer channels. Time investment of each parent up to the age of which their children turn 16, at which point cognitive skills get frozen. Children's year of education, in the period the children turn 16, the parents' household can choose how many years of post-compulsory education they get. And then, in the period the children turn 23, the children turn 23, sorry, the parents get to make a one-time cash transfer to them. Now, they're going to make these choices subject to constraints. There's going to be, of course, a time budget constraint, which is very important. The trade-off between time investment versus work. There's going to be a standard money budget constraint, of course, very important for the timing of consumption and investments over the life cycle. There's going to be a life cycle borrowing constraint, so that the parents' household are not able to borrow against their own future income. And that's going to have important implications for the funding of education of the child or cash transfer to the child, because the parents aren't able to borrow against their future income to fund that. And finally, there's going to be an intergenerational borrowing constraint. The parent's household is not able to borrow against the child's household future income. I.e., parents can't saddle their kids with debt. Now, said like that, I think a lot of people would say that sounds like a good thing, but from the perspective of the model, that's certainly an inefficiency. Now, some of the key technologies that determines what goes on in this model will be skills, production, and wages. So in terms of production function, we have that from birth to age 16, skills are going to evolve according to a production function that has this general form. Next period skills are going to be a function of parent skills, parental investment, and parents' education. the skill production function is going to differ by 3 stages of childhood. And we allow for parental education to enter the production function to capture an empirical regularity that's quite well established in this literature, that it seems that higher educated parents are more productive at generating their own children's human capital. So from age 15 onwards, wages are going to depend on the human capital produced up to age 16, and they're going to evolve according to a functional formula like this. Log wages is going to be equal to a function of age to capture the life cycle profile of wages, hours to capture the part-time penalty, education, final skills, and an earning shock. Okay, then the demographics of the model. So we saw in the timeline that at age 23, individuals are matched into couples, and that matching happens probabilistically, conditional on education. So if we have a man of a given education, has a probability of matching with a woman of another education, according to some matching function that is gender specific. So QN, the male probability of matching with a female of that probability, and we have, of course, the inverse. At age 26, we have a pair of identical twins born from the couple, and we're going to assume that the twins are faced with identical sequential shocks, which is an approach being taken from Albert et al., which allows us to reduce the complexity of the model while by having essentially kind of identical children, whilst maintaining balanced demographics, i.e. having 2 parents and 2 kids. So those are all the building blocks of the model. And at this point, I could show you all the decision problems, but I think there's not much to be gained at looking at all the decision problems, all the Bellman equations in every single period. But I do want to show you the Bellman equations just in one key period, and that's the independence phase, when the child's household separates off from the parent's household and becomes independent, because I think this is a key period to capture a lot of the intuition of what's going on in the model. And I have a slight issue with the button, so it's a little bit, okay, this is the Bellman equation in the period in which the child separates from the parental household. Okay, so the parental household wants to maximize some lifetime utility, and they do so by choosing consumption for both parents, hours worked for both parents, and the cash transfer to make to the children. That lifetime utility is going to be composed, of course, of a flow utility, the first term, capturing today's utility, and then of continuation values. But there's going to be 2 continuation values. We have the last continuation value here, which is discounted by beta. And that's just the standard time discounting of time continuation of the continued existence of this parent's household. But then we've got this other continuation value, which is the child's continuation value. Now, this isn't discounted by beta because the child's household is going to separate from the parent's household immediately. They're leaving now. But there's no point in having time discounting, no reason to have time discounting. But it is going to be discounted by lambda, which is this altruism parameter, capturing how much one generation cares about the next differential. We also then times that continuation value by 2 to capture the fact we have 2 identical children. We're going to try and solve this Bellman equation subject to time and money budget constraints and life cycle and intergenerational borrowing constraints. And the first expectation operator is over a child's initial wage, so their initial productivity, and the future starting attributes. And the second expectation operator is just over next period's parental wage draw. So this hopefully was answering your question, Jim, about where the children enter and how the parents care about them. This is really the key period to answer that question.
But there's no reverse altruism. There's no sense that the parents are going to be supported by the
children. No, and that's precisely why we we extract from that family of all the literature, and that's why transfers are made at age 23, because then you can just treat the households as separate. Otherwise, we have this problem of it turning into a dynamic game on top of the dynamic model. But yeah, that's a dynamic with a result. Yeah. Okay, so that's the model. And now we're going to take some data to estimate it. As I alluded to at the beginning, the main data source we're going to use is National Child Development Study, or NCDS, follows the population born in 1 week in Britain in 1958, from birth right up to now approaching retirement. And the NCDS has almost everything we need. It has details on the inputs to child skill production functions, so parental characteristics and investments. It also has information on those child outcomes, child and adolescent skill. It also has data on labour supply, earnings over the life cycle, and wealth in early life. We are going to have to supplement a few people with 2 data sets now. We're going to supplement the NCDS, firstly with data from the English longitudinal study of aging. And from there, we're going to take wealth late in life and money transfers between the generations. And then we're going to supplement it with data from the UK Time Use Survey. And from there, we're going to take moments of time. More specifically, we're going to get time with children by parent and age of child, i.e. the time spent with the kids by mothers and fathers at the time. We need to supplement the data from the UK Time Use Survey because the NCDS has really rich, noisy measures of parental time spent with children, and that will lead to us having a latent factor for the time investment in children's human capital. But we need to convert that into a real cost. Our model is not going to be in terms of latent time spent with kids, but in terms of minutes and hours. So we need some way to map that latent time investment to real time units. We're going to rely on the UK Time Use Survey for that. Where we do supplement the NCDS, we do work very hard to try and make sure that the generations used here are as close to the NCDS cohort as possible. Okay, estimations. We're going to follow like an identification. We're going to follow like a 2-stage simulated methods of moments approach. So in the first stage, we estimate things that can be productively estimated outside the model set. Most importantly of those are, technology which relates to investment during the life cycle to earnings. So, firstly, child skill production. And then we estimated accounting for measurement error in skills and investment, following a similar approach to Agostinelli and Wiswell. So, a few more details on that. So, our final skill production function is going to have this function of form. Next period log skills are going to be a function of current period log skills, log parental investments, and an interaction term, plus fixed effects from other and private education. So basically log linear with an interaction. And we're going to follow a similar estimation approach to Agostinelli and Wiswell. We use multiple skill and investment measures to correct for measurement error in each other. So for each time period, for each variable, we construct a measurement system where we have multiple noisy measures, and we use one noisy measure to correct for the measurement error in another using systems IV approach. Okay, as I just said, this production function is going to be in terms of units of latent time. So we need somehow to anchor this units of latent time to the model's units of real time. There we're just going to propose a log linear relationship where log investment is linear in the log sum of total parental time of kids. Okay, we're then going to estimate in the first stage ways the function of ultimate skill and education. Again, we're going to estimate this accounting for measurement error in skills using those multiple noisy measures. We're also going to account for measurement error in wages and account for selection into employment. Then in the second stage,
So, but the investments are choices. Why are they all telling them all?
okay, you're worried about the endogeneity of investment choices. You worry about the endogeneity of investment choices? Yeah. I'm afraid here I don't have a good answer for you, and I think
But you have a model.
we have a model.
It's coming after.
Oh, yes, but I'm not using, so, yeah, but I don't, so. It's actually a good point. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point. I think we could try and correct for selection in the production function using the model in an analogous way to what we do with the wage equation. So for the wage equation, we estimate it on the data, and then we make sure that the model replicates the bias. So we have an input, which is the initial estimated equation, and then we estimate again that equation on the data to correct for the bias, following that French 2005. And I guess we could do a similar thing with the production function, actually. I thought of that. Yeah, that would be a good suggestion. Up till now, I think we are following the literature. Even outside the model, there just aren't good instruments, I think, to deal with endogeneity in these production functions. So that's where well, that's actually, we could combine the two. We could combine the two.
But you're using a covariance structure, which in some sense is the type of instrument, just using exclusion restrictions of one variable being excluded. Oh, okay, thank you. From another. So I'm not sure why you say it's so difficult. You're using that kind of principle already, aren't you?
To account for measurement error, yes.
Yes, but generally for endogeneity as well, don't you? I mean, and you have a set of covariance relationships. You want to call them instruments, that's fine. A set of exclusion restrictions. I'm not sure why you can't use those just as well in the production technology as you can on this measurement of skill technology and so forth.
I'm not sure we have plausible exclusion restrictions or on the choice of investment.
But maybe you have a whole set of investments here, right?
You have we have one underlying investment. We have multiple major measures of our one underlying latent investment variable.
There's many indicators. I'm just saying there are lots of potential restrictions to consider, right?
Yeah. But there are lots of potentials. I don't think we hit on any that would necessarily really convince the literature, but yeah, there's lots of potential measures, and yeah, maybe if you had some suggestions, I'd be very interested to hear.
I just don't see it as that asymmetric. You reach for these measurement issues very separately, kind of what was just said. From the production technology, you have a set of exclusions related to covariances.
Yeah.
Say the measurement area here is unrelated to the measurement area there. The shocks in technology might be unrelated in various ways. I'm not sure. Specifically with your data, it seems like you have a pretty big choice of inputs. Right?
We do. That's a fair one.
So it's not clear that just moving synchronously. That's all.
Yeah, I did not mean I didn't mean to imply there was any bigger asymmetry in that. But yeah, I'm not sure what we could use, but if we do have any options, I think we should be going further about it. Yeah. Thank you.
So the model can't care about
Yeah, indirectly to the right.
Data we have, you're only having one specific algorithm to ask them. You have to assume certain stationarity in the sense the production function, the return to prime investment.
Yes, we assume stationarity in technology, not in distributions. So we assume that the technology between one generation to the next is the same. And so we can equate the value functions conditional on state variables, but we don't impose a stationary distribution.
These are different times, not the day cohort versus the
I mean, that happens anytime you use data with time variation, you have to assume that to some degree that
There's certainly plenty about the variance of government policy across these cohorts. That's an obvious improvement. The sense of educational policies, the kind of transfers that are given, the whole notion of the red brick universities going across one generation to another. I'm not. That's a form of non-stationarity, which looks like it could be serious.
I guess we say conditional education will have the same wage trajectory, and I agree that's a big assumption, given the changes in educational technology in the time, but
And in the labor market, the pricing of skills.
yeah.
So,
Yeah.
can't you make some adjustments, in some sense, allowing for non-stationaries? It's problematic.
Apology for those of you that are listening. We're trying to get
We'll maintain
those
relations with
that are using the microphone in the room to actually hold it to their mouth. We have asked, I don't know on how many occasions, but
Also,
they're
in terms of education
talking, I'm afraid,
policy,
directly to the person and not really understanding that they need to lift the microphone up. We have asked on several occasions. So apologies if you haven't heard these clearly.
Under, as opposed to the ones the parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest based on model that would turn up would be on the wage equation, the impacts of education for wage equation, wages, because, yeah, you have post-compulsory education impacting wages. It's basically education is a pure choice. There's not too much on the education dimension of technology, except the Southeast for wages. What you do. But I think absolutely, including some wage growth might be good. I mean, there's a, yeah. You could think of this as, maybe I don't want to make that argument. E-trend, what I was going to say, but maybe this is not a good line of E-trend. So yeah,
Maybe give you some sensitivity, that's all.
yeah.
Extent to which you estimate that.
Yeah, great. Thank you. How am I doing for time? Yeah, okay. So I'll try and speed up a little bit here. So we estimate everything by simulated methods of moments. And so everything is jointly estimated from all parameters are jointly estimated from all moments. Here I've just placed in brackets some of the most important moment for a given parameter. So we have the discount factors identified from wealth, consumption weights very much from labour supply and relative labour supply, risk aversion very much from potentially from precautionary labour supply, but also between the choice between differentially risky investments like educational investments or money transfers to kids. The altruism parameter can very much be identified from the level of cash transfers between generations and also from educational investments in children. Now, I want to hopefully quickly say a little bit more about the identification of these last two parameters. So up to here, these are shared parameters with other dynastic models. Whereas the last two parameters are slightly more novel. We have first, and what I want to say is also that we have up to here made no use of either time investments for identification items or the distribution of skills. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to argue for identification of the anchoring of latent investments to time investment and these are the share of time with people who work using these two moments, conditional and having identified everything else. Okay, so we have our mapping from units of time to production functions, units of latent time investments, have this functional form. Now, the identification of the constant term, kappa naught, for each period, is actually, once we have kappa 1, very straightforward and mechanical, right? Because we want the mean of time investments observed in the UK time use survey data to map to the mean of latent investments, which by construct 0 anyway. To identify kappa 1, we're going to get identification from that from the final skill distribution. So, and that is the dispersion in the final skill distribution given some observed dispersion in time investment. Okay? So we observe time investments, we can see how dispersed they are. If we make kappa 1 far too large, then conditional on this dispersion in time investments, the distribution of final skills is going to explode. It's going to become far too dispersed. Conversely, if we make kappa 1 too small, conditional on the dispersion in time, the final skill distribution is going to collapse. So we can kind of identify kappa from the distribution of final skills. Oh, here we go. So in terms of identifying theta, the argument is relatively straightforward, I think. Once we have everything else, we've now got the production function, we've got the anchoring of time, latent time to real time, you've got all the other model parameters. Theta is identified from the requirement that these time investments are an optimal choice. The parents want to choose to spend this amount of time with their parents, their kids, sorry. So we proved this in sort of a simplified model, but the intuition is very straightforward. Parents will invest time up to the point that the cost, which is going to be theta times their wage, is equal to return in terms of human capital. Oh yeah, I need to escape. Let's go back. Okay, on to some results. So in terms of the first stage, yes.
What's different across families? What's the difference?
Well, different across families. Good question. They have different. Begin with, they have different wealth. They have different productivity. They are born with different gender children. Their children are born with different levels of ability, and they have different levels of education. Good. Okay, in terms of the first stage estimates, our production function, the form I mentioned before, and these are the estimates we got on the key first three coefficients. We find, unsurprisingly and very much in line with the literature, that skills are persistent, so there's a significant large coefficient on the first term, lag skills, and parental investments in children's human capital are important. They do have a large, significant return in children's skill. In terms of this interaction term, which we're thinking of like dynamic complementarity, we find very modest and mixed evidence. The sign is not consistent across all periods, and not significant. It's also not significant in periods. And also, even when we do find it significant, it's worth highlighting that the magnitude of these terms is much smaller than the direct effect. So we find very modest role in this data at this time for dynamic complementarity in these investments. Where we find a much more important complementarity is between education and skills. So our wage equation has this formula of wages is equal to the function which captures the life cycle profile of wages, accounting for the part-time penalty, plus basically the returns to skills, delta times log n. So delta is a log point change in a wage for a one standard deviation increase in log skills. And we estimate this equation separately for men and women and by education levels. And you can see if you look down both columns at the education level increases, this return to skills increases, indicating a quantitatively important wage complementarity between skill and education. And I think this is important, and I just want to take a few slides to highlight this complementarity visually, because I think it's really worth seeing how this plays out. So we see that below here we have the wage profile for a low educated male with mean skills. Okay, and now I'm going to take that individual and I'm going to give them a one standard deviation boost to the cognitive skills. And yeah, the wages go up. What happens if I do exactly the same thing for a medium educated male? They get much larger. But again, if we do this again for a university, a high educated male, they get a massive increase in their wage from that increase in their cognitive skills. So we see a quantitatively very important complementarity between education and cognitive skills, indicating that the highest returns of education accrue to those who get complementary investments in the human capital. We see a qualitatively similar picture for women, although the effect is slightly modest. Okay, parameter estimates. So, I won't talk any more about the first four lines, because I think they're standard and very much in line with the literature. In terms of altruism parameter, we get an estimate of 2 times lambda equals 0.5. We multiply it here by 2 to make it more comparable to the literature, because up till now, most of these dynastic life cycle models have focused on one parent, one child, and asexual reproduction, whereas we think the important thing we bring to this is household formation and the fact that 2 distinct children. So to make it comparable, we multiply it by 2. When we do that, I think we get something very much in line with the literature. In terms of this theta parameter I talked about, you find that time invested in your kids is neither work nor leisure. It's somewhere about halfway in between, and we find theta equals 4. There's a bunch of parameters from the second stage estimates that have left off this table. Those are the CAPAs, the anchoring of time investments to latent investments. And I've left them off because there are 2 of them in each time period, so it makes the table explode, but they're also not very interpretable by themselves. I think the next exercise will show you the importance of these CAPA terms and give some interpretation to their magnitude. And that experiment is I want to look at the returns to time investments in children. Because now we have these 3 building blocks, right? We have the anchoring equation taking time to latent investments. We have the production function taking latent investments to cognitive skills. I mean, the wage equation taking cognitive skills to wages. So here we can now run an experiment. We're going to give every child in the model an extra 364 hours of friendship investment. That is an extra hour a week for the first 7 years of life. And we can see that on average, that increases the kids' lifetime earnings by £2,800, present discounted value. So if we divide one by the other, we find that on average, an hour investing in your child's human capital leads to £790 of additional child's wages. So something interesting here, and I think we can see from this a bit why we find that theta is between 0 and 1. Because that return to time investing in your child's human capital is below the wage for most of them. So the return to parental time investing in children are largely below the market wage. Now, I think there's an interesting contrast here with what we find with very famous and well-established work by Jim Heckman on the Perry Preschool, where they find that the returns to professional time with young children are massively above the market. So I find that an interesting contrast that may be worth further investigation. But of course, okay, that's just a 7.9, £7.90 is just the average. That's going to mask substantial heterogeneity.
Now, this isn't a real return. It's just a derivative of some function. I mean, the true return is, the cost, the financial cost associated with investment. So each hour, not only do you build a house, you have a kid, you go through all of maternity expenses and so forth. For the time investing in children, we include the cost of having a child in the first place, right? So
yeah, I mean, that would massively push this number down, I guess, every time we mention.
Well, possibly, but also would show that there are dimensions here that you haven't kept. And you have, like, look at even the altruism parameter. Go back a second. Fixing that here as a calculation.
Yeah.
And so you ask, well, why do you have a child in the first place? And is that enter the equation at all?
No.
And what's the return? And the return is not just in terms of dollars per hour and the wage of the kid. You modeled that way. There could be a huge amount of psychic returns, which I haven't seen modeled. Yeah,
I 100% agree with everything you say. I think looking at endogenous fertility would be very interesting and all like this. But yeah, yes, this is a first attempt at a return.
Well, I just wonder about the contrast that you're suggesting. That's all.
What
in contrast here, which is the 2010 paper, I'm not quite sure. When you're talking about professional return, I'm not sure.
I do not think I'm making a very fair like comparison. This is an initial contrast that I found. This is the first one I found this surprising. So I saw this result and I thought we must have got something wrong. Was my initial thought. I must have got something wrong because it's so well established that investments in early children have a return above.
But those are focused mostly on disadvantaged children. Those returns are very high, but only among the very disadvantaged. If you sort of take an average child and have a government program and you compare it, remember you've got to compare that too with what the parents are doing side by side. So this is a very odd comparison. That's all I'm suggesting.
I'm very pleased to learn that. Maybe we can talk more afterwards.
Okay, fine.
It's a comparison. I'm very happy to do it.
Okay, I would just qualify it a little bit. Maybe.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to you later about that. As I say, maybe a comparison. Look, as I said, I sort of highlighted it. Initially, I thought we must be doing something wrong. It's so well known that investments in children early in life have a higher than market return.
This is for the average.
Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. There are many other things over this capacity for me. Yeah. And I'd love to talk about people if we have time. So this was an average effect. as part of what we just talked about, that's masking substantial heterogeneity, and that's indicate because though partly because of this complementarity between wages and education, for those who obtain low education, those who get a lower return for the parental investments in their time. And this heterogeneity is going to contribute to substantial differences across the socioeconomic gradient, which is then going to contribute to intergenerational persistence of outcomes. We're going to contribute to intergenerational persistence of outcomes. And I've got 2 minutes, so I should wrap up by talking about our intergenerational borrowing constraints experiment, because intergenerational borrowing constraints are a key inefficiency in our model. And intergenerational financial transfers are often central to student financing. And student loans are used in many countries to finance university education. They lower public costs and they expand access to university education. So economists, we tend to love them, but they're often unpopular with the other. And we're going to look at that through the lens of our model. We're going to study the introduction of student loans, allowing parents to borrow against children's future income. We're going to allow them to do so with 2 caveats: only if their child goes to college, and only up to a cap that prevents borrowing more than the cost of college. What do we find when we do this? Well, we see that student loans increase lifetime wages as more kids go to university, and they reduce the intergenerational persistence of outcomes. Now, this is in terms from the dynasty's perspective, this is a pure relaxing of borrowing. So from the dynasty's perspective, this is necessarily welfare improvement. But because we have this lambda term, this differential pairing of utility, not necessarily welfare improvement from the perspective of the children, because the parents don't fully internalize their child's utility. And so what happens if we look at the change in the welfare of the children in terms of the compensating asset they would accept for the change between the environment? Well, we see that on average, it's true. The welfare of these children actually goes down. But this average effect is averaging over 2 different groups, very different groups. There's the marginal kids and the inframarginal kids. Now, the inframarginal kids, who are high education and baseline, this makes them much worse off. Because all it's allowing the parents to do is borrow against their future earnings in order to fund their education. But for the marginal kids, those not high educated in the baseline, it makes them much better off, because now some of them are going to university. Again, this distinction between who's marginal and inframarginal is going to have implications across the socio-economic gradient, contributing to intergenerational persistence, because children of low educated fathers are much more likely to be marginal. We wondered if we could improve this, because this is a very blunt student loan policy. We wondered if we could improve it by targeting it at the most able children to take advantage of this complementarity between cognitive skills and education. So we make student loans only available to students in the top half of the skill distribution. What happens when we do this? Well, we do by better targeting it to those best able to take advantage of student loan, make this on average increase the utility of the children. But it comes at a cost in terms of intergenerational fairness, because it no longer really reduces intergenerational persistence of outcomes. Why? Because higher educated parents are most able to make the complementary investments in their children to get them up to higher cognitive skills, to get them eligible for these student loans. So that's it. Everything I've got. I'm probably out of time, so that's the conclusion, but it just summarizes.
So we're missing one policy, though, which would be in terms of your production function of technology, the early stages. So how would you build a skill that would allow those kids to take advantage of these complementarities you found? That's missing so far in this model, in this calculation.
In this calculation, yes, we have done a lot of experiments along those kind of lines.
And
I don't have all the results off the top of my head, but I'd be interested to know what you think are the most relevant experiments there, because maybe we can get some new suggestions for that.
well, it just sense that in the early years you'd be building the skills that would then feed into the later stage technology.
Yeah.
And I think that would be a good policy to consider as an alternative to, or at least a complement maybe with this policy.
Yes,
It's in your model, that's all.
Yeah, yeah,
So just speak it to them.
yeah, we have done a lot of experiments along those lines,
So what do you find that there's a trade-off? A dollar for tuition versus $1 for early childhood?
we haven't specifically done it. That'd be a good thing.
Sorry, wow.
Sure. Good for you.
One thing that we have done a little bit is try to think about parental leave, for example, which,
Yeah,
which fits very naturally within the context of our model. And we think that it is an interesting policy that does slightly boost skills of children, but parental leave is, at least in the context of this model, it's mostly just assumed as leisure for the parents. So in terms of thinking about the economic return to parental leave, it's actually quite low. It would be interesting to think about other types of.
But how many two-parent families are there? I mean, a lot of single-parent families here too. So what does parental leave mean? It means you're subsidizing the woman to stay at home, and then you have a calculation on that. How prevalent in Britain is the single-parent family issue for children? Right now, these are two-parent families, right?
I think it's very common now, but pretty uncommon for this cohort.
Uncommon for the couple.
Yes. I don't remember the big ones, but I think, yeah, this one.